Hello everyone, welcome to another lesson on Three.js for beginners. So our topic for today will be materials. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to jump along. I've created another file, index.html. The index is what is going to be running on our browser when we run our server. So just make sure that that's always so. So what I'm going to do is then create another HTML5 document. And so just to speed things along, I already have a script that is prepared, so I'll just take you along the process. Okay, so what we're going to do is first then create our canvas with the ID canvas. Let's make sure that this is big enough for you guys to see. So there we go, we've got our canvas. Okay, first before we import, let's first create a script element. And then the type will be module. Type module. Okay, so inside the script, then we will import our library. So we will import our Three.js library, just like we did previously, and we will import our GUI. So if you've been following along in this tutorial, then you can just basically use your old script and just remove anything else and just keep the basic settings like your renderer and so. But if not, then you can just follow along with me. So what I will do here is I will create another renderer. Okay, so we create a renderer here. So here are the settings. I'm using the canvas as usual, and I've set the size to window width and a height. Renderer set pixel ratio, I've set it to window as device pixel ratio. So these are the basic settings that you should be by now familiar with. Next, perspective camera, nothing new, basic settings that we've always had. Then we create our scene, and in this instance I'm going to create two lights. So I'm creating 2-point lights. So one is light and the second one is light 2. Okay, so in this lesson I will create 5 geometries, and each one of these geometries is going to be using a different material. The materials that we're going to focus on for this lesson are 5. So we're going to start with mesh basic material, and then mesh Lambert material, then mesh Phong material, and then mesh standard, and then last but not least, then we look at our mesh tune material. So we will start with our mesh basic material, and for that I will use an icosahedron geometry. So here we go. I will call it icosageo, the icosahedron geometry, and these are the values. So just make sure that your values look like so. Okay, so now that we have our icosahedron, we are going to add it to our scene. So we say scene.add icosamesh, and what we will also add is our light. So we add both our lights into the scene, and once we have done that, then I'm going to position our mesh. So I'll say icosamesh.position.y equals to 6, and then underneath that I'm going to add the positioning for both our lights. So for the first light, these are the values for our position. So position y equals to 6, position z equals to -3, and position x equals to 3. And for light 2, position y equals 6, position z equals 10, and position x equals -3. And last but not least, we will add positioning for our camera. Now we will position the camera's position y to 3.5 and the position z to 11. And then we will use a method called camera.lookAt, and this is where we will place it. It's new3.vector3. So position x will be 0, y 3, and then z will be 0. So use these exact values so that your scene looks exactly like mine. Okay, so next I will create a GUI. So I will say const GUI equals new GUI. Now our mesh basic material has a few properties to it, but the properties that we're going to focus on in this particular material is color, alpha map. We're going to use the wireframe. Now wireframe is inherited from the basic material object, which all the different types of materials, they inherit their properties from. So we're going to use color, as I said, alpha map, wireframe, transparent, and alpha test. So these are the ones we will focus on for now, and then we will progress as we go. Okay, so What we're going to do now is create a data object just like we did in the previous tutorial. So our data object will be called icosa data. Okay, and these are the values that we're going to work with. Okay, our radius, detail, color, alpha map, transparent, alpha test, and scale. This is going to be useful for what we're trying to do. But the material values are color, alpha map, transparent, and alpha test. The rest are geometry properties. So you know, in order to change any properties on our geometry, we need to create a function. So we'll use this function, new icosahedron geo, just like we did in our previous tutorial. But that is mainly for illustration purposes. The main focus will be on materials. And so once we've done that, we already have our GUI. So now we are going to create a folder for our icosahedron mesh. Okay, so here we go. As you can see here, in our icosahedron function, we used the values from the icosa data object over here. So these are the values that we'll use in order to change the geometry. And now we just created a folder called icosahedron folder, and we named it three.mesh basic material icosahedron so that we can be able to identify on the GUI which material we are working with. And these are the values that are passed: the position, x, y, and z, and the scale. So we will be using that so that with each and every object that we're working with, we can scale it or move it forward so that we can better illustrate its material properties. Okay, so for color, we say icosahedron folder dot add color. Now, as you can see, this differs from these ones that we've been using before, because these are just values that we just added, but this time we're using a method called add color, and this is how you go about it. We're going to use the information from our icosa data, and then that information is going to be color. And so we're saying that when there's a change, we're going to take the value, and that value will be assigned to the color of our material. So this is how we'll go about it. And then next we will add our alpha map. This works similar to other ways that you've used. So we take that also from the icosa data object, and then we use the alpha map property, and then we will use the alpha map array. Now that we have not created yet, so I will create our alpha map array. So we will create it over here. So we'll say const alpha map array. So we just created an empty array over here. And next what we will do is we will create an object called map obj. Now inside this map obj we have two properties, and that is none, which will be equal to null, and alpha map. With this we're basically getting a texture. So this is the texture that we're going to be using as our alpha texture. So in order to load a texture, we're going to use three.textureLoader and then say .load, and then put in the name of the texture that we want to load. And this texture has to be on the same folder as our file. Otherwise, we would have to give it the exact directory where this texture is located. So the texture we're going to be using is called connected dots underscore mask.jpg. And then once we have done that, then we will use it over here. So this will just give us an option to toggle between not having an alpha map and having an alpha map. So that's what that's going to do. So how that's going to work is that every time we make changes to our GUI, it will take that value, and these values will be 2. These will be the values that will be added to this alpha map array. Okay, so the last thing that we need to do is this. So what we're going to do is, since we created a map obj object over here, so then we're going to iterate through it. So we're going to use the for in loop, and we're going to say const key in map obj. So basically it's going to say, so for each key, we're going to take that key and we're going to add it to our alpha map array. So since our map obj has 2 key values, that is none and alpha, so that will be added to our array. So when we look inside array, we will see these values. It will be none and alpha map. So what we're going to do then is, when we toggle here the value, whichever value it is, if our value here is equal to none, So it will take that and say map obj none, and that would be equal to null. But if the map obj value, if this value is equal to alpha map, then it will basically return the value of that key, which would be our map, and that will be mapped to our material. So whatever value we get, that's what will be assigned to the value of our alpha map over here. So we'll be able to toggle between the two. And then after that, then we will update our material. So every time we toggle, then it will update. Here, this is simple. We've done this before. This is just the wireframe. Transparent is also simple. It's based on true or false. And then the alpha test, this will determine how much of the alpha we want to use, or basically how the intensity of our alpha. We can only see how this works visually in order for us to understand it better. Okay, now that that is done, we will come down here and then create our render function. Okay, you are familiar with this, our function render, and then we use the request animation frame to call our render, and then over here we call it for the first time, and then it will just keep repeating. Okay, so now let's run our HTTP server and then go to our browser to see what our scene looks like. Okay, it says here that I cannot access before initialization. Okay, let me fix that. I know what the problem is. I need to move this down. I'll put that over there. Okay, so what I need to do is, because I want to use this texture over here, I have to make sure that I have the texture. And currently I do not have the texture. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to this folder and then I will load this texture. Okay, I just did that. I just added my texture. So now this will work. Because before that, then it would just tell me that this texture is not loaded because it is not there. It cannot be found. So there we go. Okay, here we go. So we've got our icosahedron over here. I'll just bring it down, bring it a bit closer. Okay, so here's our alpha map toggle. Like I said before, this is none, which means there is no alpha. Now we have an alpha, and I'll say transparent. So now you can see what this does. And what our alpha map does is it determines how strong the alpha is on our material. So you can see this is what it does. And then of course you've got wireframe. And you can see that this also influences our wireframe because you cannot really see some parts of the wireframe. So when that is off, then you see the entire thing. So that these are the values for our first material, which is the mesh basic. It has other properties, but these are the ones to first work with in order to not confuse ourselves, and then the rest will follow later. So just for a beginner, this is best to work with this. Okay, so now we're moving on to our next material, which is mesh Lambert. Okay, I just want to clarify one thing. As you can see here in my mesh basic material, because I had copied and pasted this, then there are a few mistakes that I need to fix here so that I don't confuse you guys. These values that were there, they do not belong there because this material does not have these values. Okay, so just I want you to take note of that. So the next geometry we're going to use is a torus. And the material that we're going to be using is a mesh Lambert. So here we go. We've got a mesh Lambert. And I'm keeping it basic. So the only values that we're going to add here in the beginning is just the color and side. Just we want it to be double-sided. So the next thing we will do is to add our mesh to the scene. We'll say torus. Okay, so I just added that to our scene. And then next up, we're going to create, similar to what we did here, we're going to create a Taurus data object. So over here, we've got our Taurus data, and the material properties that we're going to add is color and emissive. So the next property that I want to cover is emissive. Okay, so this is a property that you find in our Lambert. You also find it in Form and Mesh Standard and everything else except for our Mesh Basic. Okay, so our Mesh Basic also has an alpha map, It also has alpha test, but we're going to focus on emissive because we have already looked at alpha map and alpha test. So now we're just going to add this one, which will in this lesson be exclusively for our Lambert material. Once we've done that, then we'll also create another function, which is to create our geometry, our Taurus geometry. So when we make changes to that, then we'll easily be able to adjust. And next, we create a folder just like we did, and this folder will be called three.mesh_lambert material and Taurus. So this will be a Taurus geometry using mesh Lambert material. These are the basic values that you're already used to. Most of the values are straightforward. We know how to get our color. So for emissive, we're going to do it this way. We're going to say add color, and we're going to take emissive from our Taurus data. So we say emissive on change, and then we take the value, and then we assign the value to our Taurus mesh.material.emissive, but we will use a new 3.color value because that's how you best do that. So this is how you go about assigning color for our emissive value. You do it this way. So once that is done, so just go through all of these values. Most of them are repetitive, so you can just copy and paste. The only thing that is different in this case is just the emissive property. Okay, let's have a look at our browser. So we'll go over here and let's bring this closer. I'll just move it up a bit. So here we go. So this is our Taurus mesh. We've got our wireframe, and we can set our emission. So at the moment, let's just choose a color consciously. So we'll take that color, and then for emissive, this is what emissive does, you see. So you can play around with these colors. So this is what emissive looks like. So we can change our color again. We can make it red. And now we've got our blue emissive value. We can make it green, or we can make it purple. So there we go. So now we've added our emissive to our material. So that's what you can do with a mesh Lambert material. The next one in line is a sphere geometry, and the sphere will be assigned a mesh form material. Now in our mesh form material, we will look at specular. We will also add emissive. We will add specular, then bump map, bump scale, flat shading, the alpha map you're already familiar with, and then the rest is similar: transparent, alpha test, and scale. Before we create all of that, we will first create a bump map list array. So we'll say bump map list array. That's an empty array that we're going to create. And then next, we're going to create a bmap object. Now in this object, we're going to have these values. The default, say default, will be null, and bmap text will be the texture for our bump map. And we're going to use the same texture that we use for connected dots because bump map uses grayscale. So how that works is that the white parts will be extracted. It would look as if the surface is being pulled. We will iterate through the object, and we will then add the key pair values to our bump map list. So we'll take those keys and then we'll add them to the list, and we'll use it the same way that we used our alpha map texture. Okay, so now we can create our sphere data object. We've got our color, emissive, specular. So these are the new ones: specular, bump map, bump scale, flat shading, alpha map you're familiar with, transparent, alpha test scale, and so on. And then after that, then we'll create another function. Now this function will be for the sphere geometry, for any changes that we make to the geometry, which will mainly be scale. And then next we will create then our GUI folder, which will be called three.mesh_form_material sphere. So we'll take all of that. So this is our sphere folder, and then we'll basically create a new GUI folder, and then it's called three.mesh_form_material. We'll be using a sphere geometry. All of these are standard. You're familiar with that. So the new thing here will be our specular, our bump map. So I will go through all of them just to show you how they all work. And before we forget, we also need to add our sphere. Okay, so here we go. So now we've added our sphere geo and material. We added our mesh form material with basic values, and then we've got our sphere mesh over here. So now we need to add it to our scene. There we go. Just say sphere. Another thing that I need to also do is adjust the positioning of our objects, because at the moment some of them are overlapping each other. So I'll take our Taurus mesh and I'll put it into the Y position with these values. So our Taurus mesh position Y is equals to 4.5, and then I'll take our sphere mesh and its position Y will be equal to 3. So these are the values that we're going to be working with. Okay, so there we go. So here we've got our sphere. Let's bring it forward. Okay, we've already seen what Emissive can do. Let's go to Specular. So here we can play around with our Specular. We can also give it a bit of color, as you can see. These are the different colors that you can use for your Specular. And now we're going to add our bump map. So let's say bump map texture. So that's what you get. And that's the bump scale. -1, you see it kind of pushes the surface in. And then here it pushes it out. So I'm hoping that you can actually see the difference here. But yes, this is what that does. And then you've got shininess. See, without the shininess, this is what it looks like, and with shininess, so this also ties into our specular. And then flat shading, this is what flat shading looks like. So at the moment it's smooth, and we can make it flat like that. So these are the values that you get with our form material. So you can play around with them and understand them better, and play around with different textures that you can find to see the different effects that you can get with it. So as to others, they still work. That is our alpha map. We can still use our alpha map if we want to. So that still works, you know. So that looks kind of interesting with the shininess over there. Or you can just play around with that. So that is an interesting kind of look. Well, so yeah, it's all up to you. Play around with that as much as you like. So that's our mesh form material. So the next one in line is our mesh standard material. And for that, we will be using a cylinder geometry. Let's go back to our code. Okay, now we will create a cylinder mesh. So there we go. Here's our cylinder mesh. We've got our cylinder geometry, and then we've got a mesh standard material, and we have our cylinder mesh. So now let's create our cylinder data. So for our cylinder data, the values that we'll be working with is color, emissive, specular, bump map. These you are familiar with. The new ones that we'll be using is metalness and roughness. So you will see what metalness and roughness does. And as you've noticed, we don't have shininess for our mesh standard, only with our form material. Okay, so now we create our cylinder geometry once again for our geometry values, and then we create a new folder for our group. Okay, so in here we will have our metalness, roughness, and these are the only new ones. The rest you are familiar with. And once again, we would like to also set the position for our cylinder mesh. First, let's add it to our scene, and then we give it a position. So the position Y for our cylinder will be 1.5. Let's have a look. So there we have our mesh standard cylinder. So the rest you are familiar with. I'll just, let's check that out. So bump scale, okay, let's still do the bump thing. That works fine. Okay, let's remove it. Now metalness. This is what metalness looks like. Doesn't seem to be so clear, but basically it's a metal surface. and you can play around with that, and by using the roughness. So with the roughness, then you can either completely remove the metalness, or you can just influence just how much of the metalness property comes through, you know. So you can see here you have a better idea of what that might look like. Maybe let's change your color to like a bluish color, something like that. You know, so you can play around with that. But yes, that's what metalness does. And you still have the others. You can play around with your alpha map. So there's so much to play around with. So ultimately, yeah, that's what that does. Okay, so you can still have your emission even on top of all of that. You can still play around with your emission. Let's see the alpha test. You can still do that. So all of that is available for you to play around with. But the main thing with the mesh standard material is the roughness and metalness. And so last but not least, we are going to check out a mesh toon material. Now, mesh toon material is very cartoony. So it's basic really. It's almost like two-dimensional. It's quite flat in comparison to the other materials. So I will just show you the different variations of it that you can have. So let's just jump right into that. So for that, we're going to use a sphere geometry once again, because that illustrates the point better, just in terms of how the light hits the material and how the shadows fall. So yeah, let's do that. Okay, so now we've created our, I called it toon geo. So toon mesh, but we're using a sphere geometry. So I will add that to our scene, the toon mesh. And this we will just leave alone because it will be at our 0 position. So that should be fine, since that will not be occupied by anything else. Okay, so the first thing that we'll create is a tone map list. Okay, now that's an empty array. Now this function will help us generate our textures, which will influence, or which will give us the different options of the tones that we can have for our mesh toon. So this is pretty straightforward. You just follow along. Do make sure that everything looks like it does over here. So this variable will be loading our texture, which is a 3-tone JPEG. This one over here loads our 5-tone JPEG. And then we will use these properties that are already within Three.js, which help us to manage these textures. So you've got the 3-tone minimum filter, and then you've got your 3-tone mag filter. So you always do it this way. There is no other way that I know of, but this is how you manage your mesh toon. Same here. So this will return this object over here. So you've got 3 options, either null, 3-tone, or 5-tone. Okay, and then we'll just create a variable which will basically, tone maps will be our object, which will hold these values. And then after that, then we will once again iterate through the object so that we can then take the keys and assign the values to our array, to our tone map list array. So by now you should be familiar with the process. And so after that, then we will create our toon data object. Okay, here's our toon data object with the properties color, emissive, specular, gradient map, and this is where we're going to be toggling and scale. Okay, before we continue, I just noticed something that that is a fault of mine, so that might also cause a lot of confusion. So I just want to fix that quickly. Here, these functions where we're creating new geometry, that actually we don't need that at all, because I'm no longer making any changes to the geometry. Let's go back. So I'm just gonna go and remove all of these things, because I think I just haven't really been paying attention to all of that, because I'm copying and pasting. I just realized that I've got all these values, which, yeah, I'm not using any of it, so it doesn't really make sense to have it, and I don't want to confuse you now, because this is not even being called or used. Okay, so hope that was the last of them. Okay, I think that's the last. Okay, everything is still working fine. That's fine. Say 3-tone. Okay, 5-tone. I still need to sort that out, but anyway, everything else is fine. Okay, so what I need to do now is get the textures. So I need to get these textures over here, the 5-tone and 3-tone JPEG. Now these are found within your Three.js folder, but what I did is that I just extracted them and just put them closer, because you have to go to a lot of folders in order to look for it. So the relative path for these textures would be that. Okay, now I'm not gonna use that. I just want to show you. So if you want to get those textures, you find them, go to examples, textures, and then gradient maps, and then you will find the textures. But I'm not gonna do that. I'm just gonna copy them and then put them exactly into the folder that I'm working in now. Okay, but this is where you will find them. Okay, here we go. I just copied them into my folder. So here's the 5-tone and 3-tone JPEG. Okay, so now that I've got that, everything should work fine. So here we go. We've got our sphere down here. I will move it up, bring it forward, scale it, just move it up also again. Okay, so let's see our gradient map, which we've got 3-tone, you see. So this is how the light falls on it. So you've got these tones that you get here, whereas without it, then you can't really see the tone so much, because I would have to switch off one light. Let me do that so that you really get how this is working. So here I'm just gonna remove one light. Let's see, I hope it's the right one. Okay, maybe let's try the other one. Okay, fine. You see already, you can see how the light hits. Okay, so that's what you get at first by default. So 3-tone will be like that, and then 5-tone, you see. So now you've got like this almost like gradient, like a variation of colors. And so you can still add your color, you can still have emission and all of that, so this is pretty cool, because you can create like really cool cartoon like graphics with it. And you can still have your wireframe, but obviously that doesn't really do much in terms of the tones. You don't really see any of that, but otherwise this is what your mesh tune material does. So you can play around with that. You can make it 4 tones. You can actually create your own custom tones that you can work with, but this is pretty cool. Yeah, I think it's awesome. So in a nutshell, this is basically everything that I wanted to cover. So you can then go on and play around with the materials as you like. Oh yeah, and one thing that I want to clarify is that I just realized as I was looking at the video right now, that in the beginning of the video I created a background mesh, which I never used, so that could be confusing for most of you. So just so that so that you don't think that you might have done something wrong, but I actually forgot to put it into the scene. So we don't actually have a background, so the entire tutorial does not have a background. It's just basically black, but I had actually created a cube with some settings. So forgive me for that, just to make sure that you're not confused, but everything that I wanted to teach you, I have taught. That's the most important thing. But yeah, just for this lesson, this is all that I wanted to cover. This is the basics to get you started and start playing around. So yeah, without saying too much, let me just cut this short and say it's been fun. Love and peace. I'm out.